Hey everybody, welcome back to the Wisdom Tradition Podcast. This is Alex Sakin, and today I'm going to be doing a long overdue questions and answers episode. I originally put out a call for this on the podcast on my Substack about a month and a half ago, and I meant to do it within a week of posting it, and I just dropped the ball and have a bunch of other stuff on my plate. And I would say overall I've just been a little bit struggling with focus to be able to multitask beyond the requirements and demands of my job, which I'll tell you about in a moment, and doing the podcast. So apologies for not doing too much with the podcast the past few months. I have a lot of stuff planned and I just haven't been able to focus and mobilize enough energy to do it. This will definitely be just a phase that I go through. I want to circle back around and get to all the stuff I have planned, but I've been working under a pretty tight deadline with my current job, and I've just been struggling to do that work and then jump on and do the podcast and writing and stuff like that on top of it. I have been in my free time, like when I am motivated to work, I've been chipping away at doing a re-edit of my series on the secret history of the 20th century, which I may retitle it when it finally comes out in book form. But I've been going back over it, been tightening the writing up and refining it, added a section or two here and there. But yeah, I'm still only about a third of the way done. The book, when it finally comes out, is going to be something like 500 pages. I mean, it's a lot of material. I also have more content along the lines of what I was doing there, which is like geopolitical analysis mixed with philosophy, sociology, psychology, all the stuff that went into that book. I plan on moving and doing an assessment of the current time period. So I wrote that as a deliberate preface for a more contemporary analysis I plan on doing. And so I want to have that book re-edited and up for sale on Amazon before I formally start work on that last that next project, which is going to look at the 21st century. And I mentioned before, my plan is to tackle the topic of the 21st century using the ideas of astrology, particularly certain writings of Manly Hall about astrology, and to use that as a means to diagnose the situation, but also to discuss the philosophy of astrology and show how you can apply it to geopolitical analysis in this really profound way. I wish I had the resources and the time to just focus on that, because that's very important and very contemporary. But before I took the job I'm currently doing, I just was completely out of money, and I put everything, all my savings, everything into it, and I had just gone as far into debt as I could go. And then I was just very blessed at the very last moment when I was going to have to go back into working in restaurants, which I hadn't done for a number of years, while since I launched my podcast and the Substack and started writing my books. I had financed all that research over the years by working at restaurants at night and then doing my studies during the day. And I really, really didn't want to go back into working in the restaurants. And I was just about to have to do it, and then through a synchronicity from the gods, I was blessed with this opportunity to actually use my expertise in philosophy and all these subject matters with my new job. So I haven't explicitly mentioned what I'm doing, but I got hired in early January by a pretty prominent public figure, a guy named Aubrey Marcus, and it's an interesting story. Like 2 years ago, when I put out a little bit over 2 years ago, when I put out my first publications, which were the zines I did, and those are, rather than write like long form books like I wrote later on once I started my Substack, the first two publications I did, one on Atlantis and one on psychology, those were done in a different style, and I tried to make it more of a almost, I was like kind of inspired by the old Life magazines. So I try to make it a more like visually dynamic presentation of information rather than long chapters. It's kind of broken up with visuals and little inserts, quotes highlighted, and little subsections. I mean, you'll know what I mean if you've ever looked at those publications. But I really like how those came out, and it'd be cool to go back and do more in that style at some point in the future. But anyway, after I published the psychology one, I remember while I was doing research for that, I was researching Stanislav Grof, and I saw that this guy named Aubrey Marcus, who had a podcast that was had a good amount of reach, he had interviewed Stanislav Grof years ago. And it turns out he actually had a personal connection with him through one of his family members. But that was the first time he kind of came on my radar. And I remember I reached out to him in his podcast to be like, hey, I made this publication. I think you'd like it. And just like every other time I've reached out to people to try to gain my audience or get on someone else's podcast, do an interview or whatever, I didn't hear anything back. I know if you have a prominent platform, you're probably getting inundated with emails and stuff. So I don't take any of it personally, but it is pretty amazing to me this far along, with the material that I put out, I have never been on a major interview or a podcast. And maybe that's just, that's just sort of a fate or whatever. Maybe it's just saving up for the right time. Maybe I'll have my big break at a critical moment or something. I don't really know as far as spending my reach. But, for the past couple of years, I've been more or less locked on a level where I haven't really grown. The podcast hasn't really grown. And that's one of the reasons why I feel a little bit unmotivated to particularly since I started this new job, to keep investing so much time and resources into it, because I feel like it's kind of stagnated. Not to say that doesn't mean a lot to keep putting out information for those of you who follow, but just so you know, I get about I usually average about 1,000 to 2,000 downloads a week, and that has not changed for years. Like there's been no sustained growth, and so it's great to be able to have retained an audience of that size, particularly after so many years of not putting anything out. And so, and people contact me all the time and tell me how much that material resonates with them and how much it means to them, and that does mean a lot. But I was never able to make it financially sustainable or sufficient, and I wasn't able to make that next leap into sort of a bigger level of influence. And like I was saying, I never had really an opportunity to, because I feel like to grow the podcast, I would need to get on another platform where a larger audience could hear me. So instead, I'm just kind of relying on new listeners to either come through word of mouth or to have stumbled on my podcast in some way or stumbled on my Substack. So with the new job I have with Aubrey, I'm working for, let me tell you how I got in touch with him. So a couple years ago, I had reached out and didn't hear anything. And I always thought that we would get along, like listening to a few of his episodes in that intermediate time. I was like, I just think it would be a good fit. I just didn't know how I could get in touch with him. Like I've just such a poor success rate reaching out to people. So I didn't even try again. And then a colleague of Aubrey's and a friend who, I don't know if he wants me to say his name or not, so I won't, but someone who's been featured on Aubrey's podcast a few times, him and Aubrey are working on or have plans to work upcoming on a new project that has to do with Empire and what's next after Empire. And it turns out this figure who is a very respectable Buddhist teacher and is a great teacher in his own right, and I'm actually just very thrilled that he found my work and was interested in it and followed me. But anyway, he was a listener of the podcast, and we had emailed over the course of about a year. I mean, he originally reached out and was like, hey, I think you did a great job. He specializes in Tantric Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, and he's a teacher in that right. He lives in Colorado. And so, I mean, he's like a professional. That's what he does. Is he works with students and tries to keeps alive this esoteric lineage of Buddhism. And he had reached out and was like, hey, great job. And after I learned a little bit about who he was, I was like, hey, come on the podcast sometime and let's get into some esoteric Buddhism. Because, if you follow my work, I have this one of the first books I wrote once I started writing longer form books, which I published on my Substack serially as I have all my books, like chapter by chapter, but was on esoteric Buddhism. And I was really wanting to have the opportunity to go revisit that material, and eventually I will, because all the books I've written, I'm gonna get hard copies of. I want to re-edit all of them, so I'm kind of going backwards. Starting with the Manly Hall book, which is out now, but then the 20th century one's next, and then I'm going to go back Francis Bacon, America, Plato, Pythagoras, and just go backwards. So one of the earliest ones, which is one of the last ones I'll get to, is that Esoteric Buddhism book, and which is rather shorter. It's only 3 or 4 chapters, but they're longer, and I'll probably add to it when I revisit it. But anyway, he, somehow found my podcast and liked the series, and he was going to come on, but we had a couple different times when he was going to come on, and it fell through. Once on my end, I couldn't do it after we had planned it, and once on his end. And so anyway, it was just kind of something in the background that we had gone back and forth over a span of almost a year, and I had no idea he was connected with Aubrey or anything like that. But then so him and Aubrey were planning on working on this project together, and they had kind of hit a bit of an impasse in it, and they wanted to bring in someone else. And this other fellow, this third party guy, who was a colleague of Aubrey's, he really liked my series on the 20th century, as I think a lot of you did, and he was like, I think Alex would be a perfect fit to bring in. And so he recommended me to Aubrey. Aubrey checked out my stuff. He didn't do a deep dive on it. I mean, this guy is extremely busy, but he looked into it enough where he wanted to talk. So the timing of it was amazing, because at that moment, this was in early January, I was totally out of funds, and I had just scheduled my first interview to go back and work in an Italian restaurant here in Richmond. I was feeling really depressed about the whole situation. Like, I felt like I had failed in my mission to launch myself as a philosopher. And I mean, not totally failed. Like, again, it means a lot to me to have put out this material. I feel like it will at some point when the time is right. I feel like the quality of it is such that it could go, if I could get on the right platform or whatever. I mean, I hope this isn't just a fantasy, but I really feel like it's the best, some of the best content out there, some of the best analysis, and it's so interdisciplinary and brings so many things together. Like, I feel like it could really blow up if it had the right links. Like, you need links and mediators and people who can champion it. Like, that's not my specialty, is marketing and things like that. Like, I all my time and energy goes into putting out the content and organizing the ideas and doing the research. So, I definitely am reliant on people to help break me if I am going to have a big increase in impact and influence and following. But anyway, so this guy recommended Aubrey. Aubrey checked it out. So the same hour, I just got word back I was going to have this interview with this restaurant. I got an email from this other guy, and he was like, "Hey, I might have an opportunity. I don't know what your situation is right now, but I might have an opportunity for you if you're looking. I have this contact, this guy named Aubrey, and he's starting this publication company, and we've been kind of workshopping an idea for a new project, new book, and it's going to be on the topic of empire, and it's going to fit right in your wheelhouse. Like, would you be interested? If you are, I can link you up, and you guys could chat and see if it's a good fit." And I was like, heck yes. Thank you for thinking of me. Like, I would love to. And then the next day, Aubrey called me, and we talked for like an hour and a half, and then he hired me right then. So I got hired by his publication company. And the book on empire that ostensibly that sort of was the cause of him hiring me, it was actually the next project in line, or one of the next projects. So anyway, he hired me to work for the publication company, and but before we get to the empire book that was originally the cause of me being recommended to him, he had this other book that he was working on, which is a more personal book. And I think I can give the title out at this point. It's going to be called You versus Anti-You. And his concept of anti-you is his depiction of the shadow, or the way he frames, Jung's concept of the shadow, and or the archetypal adversary, who, in your quest, in your soul's quest to grow and evolve, is the thing that constantly confronts you as this force that tries to stunt you, put up obstacles in your path, etc. And this is something I've talked about in a number of different contexts throughout the history of my channel. So that's what Anti-You represents. So this is Aubrey's book and it's his vision, but I've been, working with him and with another guy who's like the chief editor of the publishing house. And he has a ton of experience writing and being the editor-in-chief and sort of working with different authors to publish like lots of bestsellers, the New York Times bestsellers. And he, so a very talented guy, very experienced. So us three together are trying to make this book as good as possible. And it's definitively Aubrey's vision. And he has a lot of personal stories and anecdotes about, because he's more on the psychedelic path. And has, a wide range of experiences, also in his life experiences, but also in psychedelics that he draws from to talk about this. That's where the name Anti-You comes from. It was like a particular experience he had in psychedelics. But I'm also very impressed with him in the sense that he has, for someone who's really, a lot of his time is occupied with business and things like that. Because he's a co-founder of On It. He co-founded it with Joe Rogan years ago, and it has a number of other business interests and things like that. He so for being someone who's really occupied a lot with that world, he also has a lot of connections with philosophers, like for example the guy that introduced me to him, the Buddhist teacher. But he has other ones too. There's a guy named Mark Gavney that he is very close with, who's like a rabbi, Kabbalistic rabbi. And anyway, he's really well studied in esoteric. Just to be honest, like he doesn't have the background, particularly esotericism and kind of interdisciplinary esotericism, like I have in my writings, and having studied Manly P. Hall for so long, which is Manly Hall's specialty is like this interdisciplinary approach to esotericism. So, but he is I'm very impressed, like, at his level of knowledge, and so I can meet with him on that level and then offer my contributions from my background to help fine tune some of the ideas in the book. And so anyway, we have a deadline that we're shooting for to get the draft of this book finished, and it's a lot of work, and so it's hard for me to work on that all day. And then once that's done, which is like me sitting in front of my computer, typing and thinking and writing, and then in my free time, do more of that. Or, one of the reasons I haven't done more podcasts is not necessarily the recording part of the podcast, but it's like sitting with Premiere Pro or whatever video editing thing I'm using and, editing it. That takes a long time to edit the videos. And it's very tedious. So it's just one of those things. Like once I'm done working for the day, I just want to kind of shut off. And I've just been wasting a lot of time also on social media and YouTube and stuff like that. I definitely wasting time, but I just feel mentally tired, and that's the form it expresses. And so anyway, that's why I haven't done more podcasts, but that's also what I've been occupying myself with, is this new job. And once we hit our deadline, my thinking is that we'll move on to the next project. And I'm not going to go into details about that because that's still up for debate about what that next project is going to look like. I have certain ideas about it. But I'm thinking no matter what it is, it's going to in large part be based around a lot of the work that I've done on the topic of empire. And so I don't see how I wouldn't, because that's one of my expertise, and I think I'm definitely one of the top, has some of the best analysis that you can find on this topic. And so anyway, I want to, I'm looking forward to moving into that project when we can finally get to it. And then once we're now dealing explicitly with these things, I think I'll have more time to, because there'll be overlap between what I'm been doing lately on the podcast and what I'll be doing in this future project with him, that I will have more time to do episodes and do new podcasts and do some new posts on the Substack. So that is my hope. And again, that's why I haven't been more active. I wish I had the energy to do more, because I really have only been averaging like one episode a month the past like 4 or 5 months. So, but in my head, I have all these things I would do. But when the day's over, I'm just like, I just want to shut off. And sometimes I go through phases like this too. Like sometimes I just have the energy to just go all day, and then sometimes I can barely muster it at all. So anyway, that's what's new, and that's what I've been doing. So I'm happy to finally share more details about that with you. And without further ado, I want to kick off the question and answers section of this podcast. Again, long overdue. And I want to thank everybody who took the time to write in. I have about 11 different questions or comments, responses that I'm going to go over with you. I'm going to read out who sent it in and what the question is, and then I'll do my best to answer. So let's just kick things off. Okay, the first question that I'm going to look at here, it's from SJ, and he sent this into my email. He writes, I think the Holy Spirit represents the feminine. What say you? So does the Holy Spirit represent the feminine? So I'll just give you my interpretation. This again is heavily influenced by Manly Hall. So the Holy Spirit is an idea that's part of a Trinity. So it's the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, right? It's the third person in the Trinity. So to draw an analogy of how this Trinity looks in a different context, this would be from, let's just pick Hinduism. We have Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva. And what that relates to is basically spirit, soul, and body. Now, this Trinity here is a secondary Trinity. And it's derived from a primary Trinity. And this is something I talked about in the series I did on Pythagoras. So the primary Trinity is the Father, Mother, Child. So we have Father, Mother, Child. So the Father, Mother are the two faces of spirit. And so the Father, Mother principles become spirit and matter, which are actually, they're one thing, but it takes on the appearance of having divided. And so the spirit becomes like fullness, and the Mother principle or matter becomes emptiness, essentially. And that splitting, there's a reaction of the fullness on the emptiness. And so that creates the spark, so to speak, that the third person of the Trinity, the child, is born from. So then the emptiness becomes like the womb, and then the child becomes the actual creation. So creation can only take place once that initial bifurcation between the Father and the Mother principles, or fullness and emptiness, takes place. So the child is always nested in this middle region between the Father and the Mother principles. And it takes on the influence of each. So there's a masculine or father aspect, a spiritual aspect to the creation that results, the world soul, let's call that. But then there's also a material aspect to it. And the material aspect becomes body. And so that's the Brahma aspect and the Shiva aspect. And then the Vishnu aspect is this in between, this intermediary. And it sort of represents the soul power. Going back to the Christian version, that's the Christ principle. And it's the aspect of the divine that is in creation. It always exists in relation to a mother and a father aspect. So this third person, the child or the world soul, it also expresses itself as a trinity. So that the trinity of the world soul is Father, Son, Holy Spirit, or Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva. So that's why I say it's a secondary trinity. It's not the primary trinity of Father, Mother, Child, but it's the trinity that exists within the child. So the child principle of that primary trinity expresses itself as these three persons, Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva, or Father, Son, Holy Spirit. So the Holy Spirit is an aspect of the world soul, and the way I understand it, it's the aspect of the soul that is responsible for the form. It interfaces with the mother, which is matter, and it's responsible for form building. It builds the material form, And the three aspects of this Holy Spirit or of Shiva is creation, preservation, and destruction. So it creates the form, it preserves the form for the purposes of the spirit and soul, the higher principles, and then it dissolves the form. So those are the three functions of it. So in that sense, it's masculine because it's acting on the feminine principle, which is the mother, the material form, the material aspect. So it's the aspect of the soul that is injecting its spiritual power into matter to build the form. So in that sense, the Holy Spirit represents a masculine principle. And actually, when you see Shiva, like depictions of him, a lot of times you'll see it's ultimately an androgynous figure, but because all aspects of deity are ultimately androgynous, but because they have masculine and feminine aspects to them that are held in balance. But a lot of times you'll see you'll see Shiva depicted with like an erect penis. And that represents the sort of vital power of Shiva to inject itself into this feminine substrate and shape it. And so the aspect of the mother, which Shiva acts upon, is, I think, in Hindu, what you would call the Shakti, or the feminine counterpart. That becomes the goddess. So the goddess is derived from the fundamental feminine principle of the mother, but it's the thing that you interact with. So, because the mother is too abstract, it's sort of beyond interaction, but it's the context by which the world soul exists. So, if the world soul is when the world soul interacts with this feminine principle, it does so in relation to this active, dynamic, receptive force, and that is the goddess. And the goddess is an aspect of the world soul also. So, in a way, you could look at the Holy Spirit as being a masculine principle, but that has a Shakti that it acts upon. So, anyway, this is just the way I interpret it. Remember, always triangulate. This is what Manly Hall says, and all things triangulate, and that the method of the philosopher is triangulation. So any topic or any idea like the Holy Spirit, if you want to be like, how do I understand what this means? The first thing to do is place it within the context of a triangulation. So the Holy Spirit is part of a Trinity, which is Spirit, Soul, Body, or Father, Son, Holy Spirit. It's part of a Trinity, and it also is comprised of a Trinity, which is the Holy Spirit has creation, preservation, and destruction as its three functions. So anyway, that's the best I can do for that answer. Thank you for writing, SJ. I hope that was helpful. I know I was also kind of rambling a bit because I didn't have prepared notes in front of me for that. But yeah, that's my take. Okay, let's go to number 2. This is from John Wills, who I've gotten to know a little bit since launching my podcast. We've talked a couple times. So thank you for writing in, John. I'm going to read his question. Is it reasonable that we are witnessing the fall of the American Empire, or better, the fall of the cabal, which I presume he means the cabal in charge of American Empire, with all that has been revealed globally to the collective consciousness regarding trade, healthcare, central banking, military-industrial complex, voting systems, foreign aid and war, psychological operations, information warfare, and social engineering? The stage is set, right? Something cataclysmic, black, could thrust us across this threshold and get us back on the correct timeline. The timeline that we as a people were on prior to maritime law, central banking, and petroleum-based health and tech. I'm a big fan of people being brought to the precipice, or the idea that we're being brought to the precipice, because it's only at the brink that people will find the will to change. Only at the precipice do we evolve. And he also asks additional question, have the invisible and mysterious benevolent adepts and masters established new territory and economy for our future? I like to think that some of them were part of this realm, but perhaps they escaped. But I'll do my best here to answer this. So there is some ideas here about the fall of American Empire that I've talked about, certainly in previous episodes. I'm trying to think of how far back it was. Maybe a year and a half ago, or maybe even more. I did an episode where I analyzed a lecture that Manly Hall gave about the secret history of America. And he kind of goes over his thesis that he's written in his book and in various articles. And some of that I drew from in writing my chapter on Francis Bacon, or my book on Francis Bacon, and also the book on the history of America, which is called America, Land of the Feathered Serpent. So around that period, I did an episode analyzing one of Manly Hall's lectures on the topic. And as an introduction to that episode, before I get into Manlyhall's commentary, I talk about how in astrology, I was seeing analysis from different astrologers talking about how America was approaching its Pluto return, which means that at the point when America was founded, Pluto was in a certain zodiac sign, and then 200 and something years later, finally Pluto is returning to that point when it was originally where it originally was at the founding of the country. And so there's certain symbolism, or there's certain themes involved, I should say, when it comes to the Pluto return. And those themes very much have to do with a death rebirth. Now, I think this death rebirth is more than just America going through it. I think it's the whole world soul. And that's another thing I've talked a lot about. And pertaining to this larger theme of rebirth has to do with the Kali Yuga. And I give the take that it seems to me reasonable to consider the idea that for 5,000 plus years, mankind has been in a Kali Yuga, dark age of materiality. There is a type of symmetry to that 5,000 plus year marker where it seems to me reasonable to consider this idea of a descent into a dark age, and then there's an ending of the cycle that we might be experiencing now. And so I think so I agree with you that there is a death rebirth ritual going on, and that corresponds to the fall of American empire. That death of American empire, I think, will incorporate the fall of the public face of that empire. And that public face of the empire is what I typically refer to as the oligarchy. That is the lineage of what was once called the money trust, or the Anglo-American establishment, which is this. It's really an import from Europe. This mode of psychology and mode of social organization, but it's basically its story goes back with the history of capitalism, but it's sort of an elite ruling class who owns the capital, and it sort of operates somewhat like a guild, but it gradually has maneuvered itself to become an elite ruling class of the world. And so I track that story in the history of the 20th century, at least the modern version of it. And I know I tracked it to some degree in my history of Plato. But the history of that really coincides with this Kali Yuga. And so the culmination of the Kali Yuga, the 5,000 plus year subcycle, I think will involve an excising of this aspect of world society, this historical lineage of oligarchy. So I think that's when we talk about the fall of the American empire, I think that's what we're looking at. But in the series in the 20th century, I argued that starting around the turn of the century, around 1900, I think something else was born invisibly to this oligarchy, and I think it's the seed of what is now what people are calling the technocracy. And I feel like that was born with the discovery of this whole new paradigm of ether-based physics and technology. So I think a social entity was born to serve as the custodian of that science and tech, and that this became a sort of invisible hand that has been maneuvering from behind the scenes this oligarchy to ensure that it succeeds in its ambitions to build out a world empire and a sort of global fiefdom for itself. But I think that its goal all along is, once that whole infrastructure is set up, that it will remove that oligarchy. So the oligarchy thinks they're going to inherit the world. Once they establish world government, set up a global fiefdom, that they're going to inherit it as the sort of gods of money, as F. William Engdahl calls them. And so my feeling is that this secret entity, to maintain its level of secrecy, had to use an instrument to accomplish its goals and its purposes, long-term purposes. And so there was already this oligarchy in place who were pursuing world empire, so they used them and maneuvered them to build out world empire and to turn America into an empire. And then so they enabled them and gave them nudges along the way and sort of set the stage for them to be successful. So they did all this from behind the scenes without the oligarchy even knowing or realizing there was this deeper hidden entity. And at the right time, this deeper entity is going to reveal itself, reveal its secret tech, which all this stuff I think is related to the UFO revelations, and they're going to offer that oligarchy up for they're going to sacrifice them, because once you actually establish the world civilization that this secret group needed, you don't have a need for this oligarchy anymore. So they think the oligarchy thinks they're going to inherit the world, but they're actually going to be, in my opinion, they're going to be offered it as a sacrifice, and then there'll be a kind of reckoning for this period of tumult that has been going on, particularly since the onset of American Empire in the 1950s. And so once we move into a technocratic era, a global government governed by principles of technocracy, with AI, with digital ID systems, with central bank digital currencies and social credit stores and all that stuff. That's all that stuff is fundamentally different from capitalism. So the people who rose to power through capitalism, once we now are no longer using it as the basis of world empire, because capitalism has been the basis of American empire. So once the American empire is sort of sacrificed and it becomes world civilization, which I think we're talking about death rebirth. So the death of American empire doesn't mean China comes in as empire. It means world civilization now, formal system of global government. So that means the whole oligarchical class, the whole system of capitalism, once that is gone, the whole power structure associated with that system is also gone. If you look at the World Economic Forum, I feel like this is one of those fronts that's been set up invisibly by this hidden hand, this technocracy. Because if you look at the mode of psychology that's advocated for, and the policies are reflections of a certain mode of psychology, is materialism. It's like the opposite of what the Ether paradigm is all about. All the plans of, the Agenda 2030 and all that stuff, the Great Reset, all that stuff is reflecting a certain paradigm of psychology that has nothing to do with this deeper Ether paradigm. And so for me, that kind of suggests that this has all been a front. So the sacrifice of American empire really has to do with a fall of capitalism, fall of oligarchy, and the global fiefdom that oligarchy has set up over the past 70 plus years, even longer, 100 years. And it's going to be replaced by this new technocratic paradigm. And so this is just my analysis. Like, it's not about advocating for something. I think this is good or bad. I try to be, doing this type of analysis. I feel like people get really indulgent in trying to throw their opinion in every time they analyze a certain aspect of this. Like, I feel detached, or I try to be detached from it and just say, this is what I think is happening. And I feel like there are archetypal themes involved, and it makes sense to me from a philosophic perspective, from a psychological, from a sociological, from a historical perspective, that these things all come together and to me support this view. So to go back to your question, I do think it is reasonable that we're witnessing the fall of the American empire. I think it's part of a death rebirth ritual. I think we're on the cusp of world civilization. And so the American empire and the nation state, so to speak, as being the fundamental unit in human affairs, at least political unit, that's the thing that's going to be dying out. And that we will have an explicit system of global government. But I think that the great unexpected thing is, I feel like when that finally happens, it will also coincide with a revelation of this secret tech, of this shadow government, the deeper dimension of it, the technocracy. And so there will be a type of revelation to this death rebirth. And part of that, I think will happen. I think maybe I hope to be a part of that. Is also a deeper revelation that this technocracy is actually not the final level of things, that there's been all along a fourth level, a very deep level, and that is a level of esotericism, philosophy, secret societies, the mysteries, and things like that. And that, also that there's a shadow aspect of that. There's a archetype of it, the mystery schools, but then there is a type of shadow expression. But anyway, I think that these are all things that will be revealed as part of this death rebirth cycle. So I think that's what it's awaiting for us. It's not just a death, but there also will be a revelation. There'll be a transformation, like a caterpillar in a cocoon, and then there will be a rebirth, and the rebirth will be global government. It will be this. The revelation and the unveiling and the use finally of this secret paradigm of technology and all of these other things. So in a way, I feel like this whole process of modern history is one large collective initiation. And that's the point I made in the last chapter of my book, or the whole series I did on the 20th century. It's called The UFO, a Symbol of Initiation, and that's the basic point I make. So I'm really stoked or really excited to have that book on the 20th century finally, when I get it finally re-edited, and I'll have a hard copy out. It'll read a lot better than the original series that I put out, and I'm just really excited to have that material out there. And it really combines perfectly with the book on Manly Hall, because Manly Hall lived throughout the 20th century, so he represents that fourth aspect, that deeper aspect of the adepts and masters, because I feel like he was linked into that whole world. That's what I argue in the book. So the history of the 20th century and then the book on Manly Hall go together. And the Manly Hall one shows that, or discusses this the more deeper philosophical aspect of my analysis of the 20th century. And the other book, which is called The Secret History of the 20th Century, that's really on the story of, on one level, oligarchy, how oligarchy came to take over democracy, and then also how this deeper technocratic entity was first born, and how that acted as an invisible hand behind the oligarchy. All the stuff I'm talking about is in that book. It's also in the Manly Hall book. So if you haven't got a copy of the Manly Hall book, please do. Oh, I forgot to mention this. I got a great review of that book, which I wasn't expecting to get it, but it was from Ronnie Pontiac, who actually is one of the few remaining people who actually worked closely with Manly Hall. He was Manly Hall's personal assistant during the 80s, the last decade of Manly Hall's life, and he wrote this really great review. He published it on his Instagram. And what reminded me of it is that I was going to ask you, if you guys have a chance, please just go and write something nice on my Amazon account that has the book, to help nudge people who are stumbling upon it to get it, so they'll have an idea about how the fact that it is quality. It is a very original and unique analysis of Manly Hall. And I think I've only had less than 5 reviews, maybe even 1 review. I can't remember exactly what it is, but I know I've asked this before, but please, if I could get 20 reviews or 30 reviews just saying, hey, this was great analysis, blah, 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 check out his podcast, just something nice, it would mean a lot, because it would actually help encourage new people who are stumbling upon my work to pull the trigger and get the book. And so I know there's going to be hundreds and maybe up to 1,000 to 2,000 people who listen to this episode. So take a few minutes if you can and just go over to Amazon and write something about the book. I would definitely appreciate that. It would mean a lot to me. But let me read you what Ronnie said. This really made my day. Okay, so just as context, I actually contacted Ronnie and his wife Tamara, Tamara has a book on Manly Hall also, that for you guys who are passionate about Manly Hall. He talks about her and Ronnie's personal relationship with Mr. Hall, and gives some anecdotes and their assessment of him. And I've been wanting to have them on the podcast. We haven't made it happen yet, but I'm hoping in the near future I'll have a chance to talk about Manly Hall with them, from people who knew him. Also, if you haven't listened to it, my interview I did back when I was doing the series on Francis Bacon, I did an interview with Peter Dawkins. This is probably the favorite interview I've done, and I didn't know this, but he actually met Manly Hall and talks a little bit about his impressions of Manly Hall and what it was like meeting him. And it's just a fantastic interview. He's one of the people I have the most respect for as far as being great teachers and philosophers, and I'll use a lot of his work on that series on Francis Bacon. But anyway, here's Ronnie's comment. He writes, a while back, Tamara got a copy of this book as a gift from the author, Alexander W. Sacken, and it's a picture. He's writing this under a picture of the cover of the Manly Hall book. It says, reading this deep dive into Manly Hall's words left me wishing I had this book when I worked for him. The questions I asked him would have been better. I mean, what a compliment. Then he says, while MPH has been getting more attention, he deserves to be better known, yet his influence is quietly profound. Over 1 million copies of the secret teachings of all ages are in print and have changed countless lives. His lectures available on YouTube are a comfort to many. I had not previously encountered a writer with truly comprehensive knowledge of Hall's tremendous legacy of books, pamphlets, lectures, and journal articles. Sacken digs deeply into the archives and finds consistent themes. In this book, he explores some of the most controversial. Then he writes, Sacken takes MPH at his written word with a literalness that is required. Having known the man, his storytelling skills, and his loose ways with metaphor, I believe at times this literalness leads us into territory MPH may not have intended. But if there is a lack of clarity about the extent of metaphor in particular passages, that is on MPH, not Sacken. I'm wondering if he's referring to In the first chapter of that book, I have the section on the ordination of Manly Hall, and I cite this story that he wrote when he was in his 20s, like early on. It's in his journal he published in the 1920s called All Seeing Eye, where he talks about, it's called The Last of the Shaman, and it talks about a sort of mystical experience with this shamanistic figure in the American Midwest that he had as a child. And the reason I'm inclined to take that passage at face value rather than as just an anecdote is because there has to be some explanation of how, when he was around 19, 20, 21, he emerged almost fully formed as a teacher, as an esotericist, and how the quality of what he was writing in the early 1920s is on the same level as what he would do in subsequent decades. How could you just come out of nowhere and be like a fully formed esoteric master to the point where in the early to mid 1920s he's lecturing at the Scottish Rite Temple in San Francisco to like master masons, 33rd degree masons, and telling them the history of masonry and unveiling like the philosophic principles and esoteric themes involved in it as a true master in his 20s? Like how did he come fully formed almost? So there has to be something that happened to him coming up where he had gained some sort of an inner initiation and had his psyche opened up to influences of the spirit world, where he was able to sort of channel this wisdom from something higher than just intellectual study. And so the only thing I've found that adequately explains this idea that he underwent some mystical initiation early in his life is this anecdote about the shaman. He never writes that it's a fictional account. I mean, he writes in a personal way, like, this happened to me when I was a child. I was shocked when I experienced this and this and this. And so, anyway, that's why I incorporated that article and analyzed it as part of my coverage of Manly Hall's early life and how he emerged as a teacher. So I'm wondering if that's what Ronnie is referring to. Anyway, he concludes, with Sakin's curation, clear writing and commentary, and the illumination provided by his own research, this book is a rollicking ride through MPH's view of history and his thoughts about some of the most widespread conspiracy theories of our time. Sakin's research leads him to declare MPH, or Manly Hall, as an emissary and high initiate of the mystery schools, making this a must-read for theosophists. So thank you very much for that review, Ronnie. I really appreciate it and love to have you on the podcast anytime. All right, so let's move on to the next question. Again, thanks, John, for writing in. The next one comes from Anthony Salazar, who is one of the first people I remember being like a regular listener and regular follower since I very first launched the podcast. So shout out to him, and thanks for writing in. He asks, can and will what we call esoteric knowledge be divulged to the mainstream and general populace so as to become common knowledge, or will this kind of knowledge always attract and pertain to a smaller but perhaps more influential niche target audience? How can esoteric knowledge break through mainstream institutions' intentional resistance to it and the general populace's ignorance and disinterest in such profound topics? That's a good question. My feeling is that, first off, there are destined and inevitably will be mainstream knowledge in the future at some point. But before that happens, there has to be a resurrection of the mysteries as an institution. So once there is a resurfacing of the mysteries, which I think will coincide with this death rebirth of American empire, move to global civilization, revelation of technocracy, secret science and tech, and also revelation that there is this deeper esoteric aspect of human life. This esoteric order dates back to the old pagan religions and the mystery schools, old temples of antiquity. As part of this rebirth, there will be a restitution of the mysteries. And the mystery schools are the custodians of this teachings, of the doctrine, the esoteric doctrine. And so I don't think it will ever be mainstream without the restitution of that institution. And I think that's the proper way. You need the mystery schools to be the custodian over this type of advanced knowledge, because it's not safe for an undisciplined mind and an uncleansed emotional system and uncleansed physical system to be experimenting with these things. And so the mystery schools are the proper custodian of this, because they organize all these teachings into an initiation degrees, where you undergo the steps an organized series of steps required to adequately prepare you to advance in your studies. So yeah, I think esoteric knowledge has to be married with an institution that can be the custodian over it, and that's the mystery schools. So all that stuff I think will come as part of the death rebirth experience that we're all that this world civilization as a whole is going through in the present day. So thank you, Anthony, for the question. I hope that is an adequate answer. All right, next I'm going to move to Katie, and she writes in wants to discuss the Kybalion. She writes, "Hello, I'm so happy I found your content. I've been on a binge listening to all the podcast episodes. I've recently been drawn to read the Kybalion again. However, it feels like I'm reading a different book each time I go through it. I don't see any of your teachings posted about hermetic philosophy, and I'm wondering if you have thoughts or lessons on it. Your lessons are so valuable. Much gratitude to what you're providing." Okay, thank you for the question. So first off, let's talk about the Kybalion. It's a book of, it's sort of like an introductory book to occult esoteric philosophy. So one thing to understand about esotericism is that it's not unique to one culture. All the different cultures of antiquity had their own version of it. India had their version of it, China had their version of it, Mesopotamia had their version, etc. And so there's many different names for it, and there's different specialized approaches to it. But the main principles captured in all of them are the same. So hermetic philosophy is something that is a part of this esoteric tradition. So the teachings of Hermeticism are not any different than the other branches. It's just described and emphasized. Certain things are emphasized in a different way than they are in other teachings. Now, I do have a bunch of notes about specifically what esoteric philosophy looks like in Hermeticism. That's taken from Manly Hall stuff. I haven't got it yet. I don't know what the right home is for it. I also have a lot of stuff on the Kabbalah, which I'd like to do. And I think I'm going to combine those two fields when I do talk about them and kind of play them off each other. So I do have stuff from Manly Hall on both of those, or material from Manly Hall on both of those topics. I don't know exactly where and what context, but it's for a future work that I will get into. I haven't made that decision yet. But yeah, you're right, I haven't done the Hermeticism explicitly, but the Hermetic teachings, the lessons of them are in all of these other esoteric systems. They're all branches from one tree. Now, as far as the Kybalion itself, I think of it, this is like, I first studied this, as a lot of people do, when you're first getting into this field of esotericism or occult philosophy. And it is useful in that sense as a primer on that field, but it's very introductory. I feel like there are flaws with it. And we should remember it's branded that it's by the three initiates. Actually, that was a pen name of the guy who wrote it, which is, I think his name is Walter something Atkinson, or I don't remember his actual name, but it was a guy in the early 1900s who wrote a bunch of books under different pen names about occult philosophy, approaching it from different angles and kind of giving his summary of it. So I'm doubtful about whether that really represents an authentic lineage of Hermeticism as it was originally formed in Alexandria in the period of around 2nd century AD, I think is when it was formally born. And remember, Hermeticism it's always clothed itself under the disguise of like, this is Egyptian metaphysics from like and far antiquity, but actually it seems to be a composite that was created out of a mix of a bunch of different esoteric lineages. Egypt I think was one, but there was Neoplatonism and Kabbalism and other things were also being formed in Alexandria during that time. And I think that it was formed as an attempt to keep alive or to preserve all of these traditions that were born in Alexandria around that period. There were multiple esoteric traditions that were born. But they were all deliberately created as a means to create a new vehicle to perpetuate the esoteric teachings from the old pagan temples and their old pagan priesthoods to keep it alive in the next era, because it was clear that pagan civilization was experiencing an inexorable decline and was falling into collapse. So that's the context that Hermeticism was originally born in. It was deliberately created by the surviving masters of the old pagan esoteric traditions as a means to keep alive the core body of teachings and bring it into the next age. And so that's what Hermeticism is. It's not fundamentally different from any of the other esoteric lineages that are authentic and that survived. And so just keep that in mind when you're studying Hermeticism. You're just studying one branch from a tree of esoteric philosophy. Now, the closest thing I have to covering my version of like what are the essential teachings of esoteric philosophy given out in a similar style as the Kybalion is in the book I did on Francis Bacon. I have a section where I talk about the 7 laws. Let me find out what exactly it's called. If you go to my Substack, thewisdomtradition.substack.com, and you go to the top, go to the table of contents section, and there it has the different books that I've written. You can find the links to all the chapters of the original articles that I wrote comprising this series. And in the Francis Bacon book, which is 6 chapters, the 7 summary laws of nature, chapter 4 of that book. The 7 summary laws of nature is my version of the Kybalion, but it's drawn from Manly Hall. And so that is, like the Kybalion is based around 7 principles of Hermetic teachings, like the seven laws. And so this is my version of that. So that might be exactly what you're looking for. If you go back and listen to the episode or read the article, again, it's called The 7 Summary Laws of Nature, and it's part of my Francis Bacon, The Godfather of the Scientific Age series. Okay, so thank you, Katie, for writing in. I hope that was a helpful response. All right, next question from Kelly. She writes, how does the advancement, or he, I'm not sure, how does the advancement of AI, which has been rumored to be sentient, play into the future of our species? How does it influence the Age of Enlightenment? Are we in real trouble of a potential Skynet situation? There are threats from all sides, but I don't know if people realize the threat of AI. What do you think? I think this is a good point. It's an important issue, and it's interesting how fast this really rose into being an issue. Like 5 years ago, no one was talking about. AI was just a rumor, and then all of a sudden it's everywhere. Now, clearly, this is part of this death rebirth because when we move into a technocracy, we move into this new social order that's post-capitalism. AI is going to be a component of it. There's no way you can keep capitalism alive if you have AI replacing the workforce. Like the whole structure of capitalism breaks down. It doesn't work. The whole flow of money doesn't work in the system if you only have one side of the equation, and it just becomes like the capitalist side and the labor side is taken away. Like that's the consumer base that makes the whole system work. So the introduction of this AI technology is definitely part of the death rebirth of the current paradigm of world civilization and the creation of something new. Now, sentience is a question of really consciousness, self-consciousness. Now, I think that that's impossible for AI to create because consciousness is what, traditionally is called spirit. And it's not in our capacity, as far as I understand it, to create spirit. Spirit is divine, is from God. It is God. So what I'm trying to say is that AI does not represent the birth of consciousness, an artificial consciousness, but what it does represent is the birth of an artificial intellect. So the intellect, the capacity of the mind or the capacity of the human soul for intellect, for analyzing information, analysis, that is something that AI is like a master of. It's a cognitive machine. And it has an immense capacity to have like a godlike power of intellect. And so AI really emerges as like a manifestation of that type of intellect that's detached from the soul. And so it becomes like a tyrant. For me, this thing is arising as one of these type of adversaries, as one of these type of initiation devices that is like it's like a line in the sand. This AI machine, I think, is archetypal in a way, where it's born as this sort of final test or great test to catalyze our own discovery and reconnection of our own soul power, because the AI can't replicate this soul power. And so this is the power beyond the form. And so as long as that remains latent as a power within us, then AI has power over us. But as soon as you unlock that power, that sort of sixth sense, so to speak, or that fifth element in alchemy, that etheric element of the human being, which transcends the intellect, until you can unlock that, well, when you do unlock that, then you become the ruler over the body, over the material form, over AI. But until then, AI has the power, as long as we're overly reliant on our intellect, either individually or collectively, AI has the power to enslave us. So that's my feeling on the matter about AI. I don't think it's sentient. I do think it represents, and it's like a type of artificial intellect that man has built, a type of Frankenstein. But it only has power over us to the extent that we don't tap into our human potential. and to the larger metaphysical and conscious aspects of ourselves. And I feel like it's an archetype that's drawing us towards the creation of this. Like, it's created by man, and the people who are creating it are people who are clearly possessed by archetypes within the unconscious. And so it's like we're being drawn towards our own initiation. Okay, next question comes from Chris. He writes in and says, "Hi, Alex. What is your interpretation of Manly Hall, if he's addressed it, regarding Pandora's box? And why did Pandora refrain from releasing hope from her box into the world?" So this is a question that I don't have a good answer for. I'm not super familiar with this, the myth of this, but I did look up if Manly Hall had any writings on this, and it turns out he does have a lecture that's called Pandora's Box, The Mystery of Memory. So if you go on YouTube and you just Google Manly P. Hall Pandora, you can listen to this lecture that he does on Pandora's Box, and it's possible that the answer to the question is in that. I saw that it was recorded in 1988, so it was towards the very end of his life. But Chris, your question might be answered in that one. Sorry, I don't have a better, more comprehensive response for you at this time. Okay, next question from Conlin. He says, "Thanks, big fan of the podcast. Cheers for the wisdom, brother. My question to you is, what is the first question someone should ask themselves before going on the journey of exploring their consciousness? Cheers, dude." Okay. What is the first question someone should ask themselves before going on the journey of exploring their consciousness? Well, I'm trying to think almost what would Manly Hall say. I think the question of motivation is a big one. I think if you're purely doing it for yourself, and if you're purely doing it out of a type of curiosity to experience what spirituality is, I think you're going to hit certain barriers. Because your own biases, your own shadow complexes are, in my experience, but also what Manly Hall teaches, that you're going to hit a barrier, that these things are going to confront you as a type of adversarial force, and they're going to test you. And so if you're purely doing it as an individual journey, I think there's only so far you can go. So I think the question of motive and sincerity has to come up soon. And from my understanding, in the mysteries, that's one of the things that early on the candidates would have to be tested for, and they'd have to make it. Basically, you have to make a declaration that you're doing it. You're undergoing this initiation, and you're evolving yourself not just so that you can individually be great, that you can unlock your own spiritual potential, but you're doing it as an act of service. You're taking the vow of the Bodhisattva. You're doing it for the sake of being a useful instrument to serve others. And so that, I think, is the foundational piece. And if you are dedicated to serving others, and you are committed to forging yourself to a useful instrument to serve others, then that will set you up on a quest. And then the process of becoming useful, whatever domain, like for me, that was a quest of intellect, of scholarship. And so basically my story is that when I was about 18, almost 19 years old, I made a pledge to myself, but I made it under the stars, and I feel like I almost made it to the universe, where I was like, I'm going to try to do something and be of service. And I kind of realized that, the things that are enjoyable and good about our lives today, about modern life, those things exist because of the sacrifice that other people have made in the past. I remember I was reading Les Mis at the time, and I was very inspired by that. But I made a sincere pledge that I was going to try to make some contribution. I didn't know what it was. And ever since I made that, I do feel like that there was a guiding force that was putting me on the path to prepare me to be prepare me to be of service. Like the universe took me up on that offer, and there's been a lot of sacrifices along the way. But for me, that path was one of scholarship. Like even by that point, when I made that pledge, I had some background and was interested in like Taoism, Eastern philosophy. I was also by the time I was, 16, 17, 18, I was already studying like, what I thought of as the world crisis. Like I was studying world history. I was looking at things like the books like Guns, Germs, and Steel and Collapse by Jared Diamond. Like looking at I wanted to understand like the big picture span of civilization and also like what all the crises are in modern time, and also to be aware of the extent of suffering of people in the world and how unsustainable and untenable the system that we have today is. So yeah, that pledge came first, and then later on there was another significant event, which is when I was in my early 20s. I was in grad school, and one of the first classes that we took in the program I was in is that we did a Myers-Briggs. I think the first class of grad school, we did a Myers-Briggs test, and I got my type back, which is INTP, and it's called, the subheading of that is the architect of ideas, and that it sort of made clear to me that I was good at, had certain strengths, things I was good at, and then certain things I wasn't strong in. And so I was like, if I'm going to make a contribution, it was important for me to realize that. It was like confirmation that, okay, if I'm going to make a contribution, I should focus on the things I'm good at because I'm most likely to develop an expertise in that field. And so that was really, scholarship, and, I was basically trained academically as like a social scientist. So it was in that field. And so that, when I really fully invested in trying to be the best social scientist that I could, and being a unique thinker, and I felt like from an early age, even in my 20s, I realized that I could make a contribution in the field compared to what I was studying, what theorists were talking about, and that it was a time for immense change, so that there was openings for new ideas and new theories and perspectives to come out. That was one of the things that helped me make the commitment to doing that, and to doing that on my own, essentially, not working under someone else, because I never found anybody else I thought was worthy of dedicating myself to being their mentor and studying under. And I was also somewhat geographically confined, because at that point I had a son, and I had to stay in the DC area, so I was confined to using the resources I could find in that area, which were not a lot for the things I was interested in. Because, DC is like the homeland of empire and bureaucracy and all that. And I was really trying to use the resources of social sciences to go against that. And then later on, I added the esoteric philosophy stuff. But anyway, that's just an anecdote from my own life. But in general, Manly Hall it was like you need to commit to the larger cause and take the vow of the Bodhisattva, essentially. And that once you do that, then your own path, your own spiritual development will coincide with that path of learning to be of service, that your growth will come then. And this is a process. I'm not saying that I'm beyond this. I mean, I feel like I'm still at an early stage of my own spiritual growth, particularly because I'm so locked into this using my intellect all the time. Like my emotional aspect of myself, my physical engagement with life, those are the things that are detriment in my psychological profile, and I also find those in my horoscope. And so, like, the goal of life is to be a balanced individual and to bring all things into expression. Like the circumstances of my life and the kind of commitment I made, I've gotten so over-specialized with thought intuition aspects of myself that my emotion sensation aspects of my psyche are so blocked off that, a lot of times I struggle with depression. And it's not a depression like life is meaningless. It's depression like I'm not giving my own soul the things that it needs to thrive. Like I'm very blocked off, and I need to find space to express myself emotionally and to have a better physical engagement. But I work so much on the computer, sitting in front of the computer all day, every day for so many years, that it's just like, I feel like something that my emotional body is like revolting against me in a way. And I also have a really weak liver, and the liver is connected to your emotional body. And so so it's like that manifests physically, that blockage. And so anyway, there's an aspect of this whole journey that I'm still working through, which is like you have to address your shadow complexes. You have to work to cleanse the body, like before the advanced work comes with breath work and the kind of like experiences of transcendent consciousness and things like that. There has to be a type of cleansing physically and emotionally, and also a disciplining of the mind. Like you have to be a student. You have to learn to unthink things that aren't true and that won't serve you in this path. So that's where philosophy for me comes in. So like put the mind in a certain type of order that will support a type of well-rounded spiritual growth process. But when saying that, it's like I need that for myself as well. So anyway, those are the things that I think that you should think about as you move into a new path in your life and you're ready to leave behind the sort of old materialistic, egotistical way of living that's like commonplace in our society and move towards something new, is that these are the things that you all have to address early on. And if you don't, you're going to experience the universe will give you a counter reaction. You're going to experience these things as a type of karma if you don't address them early on. And so, that's my advice, is to ask yourself about your motivation, ask yourself what you're willing to sacrifice, and really you have to take a leap of faith. Like, you have to put your faith in sort of your higher self to guide you and to bring you through periods of suffering that you will go through. Because when you make that commitment to be an initiate, to go through the initiation process, there's a speeding up of the wheel of karma. A lot of unresolved things within yourself will now have to be brought out and confronted. And so you'll go through periods of like real hardship almost immediately once you start this process. So just don't get caught up in a fantasy about what it looks like to evolve as a soul. Like evolution is not just advancement, it's also shedding, and that the process of shedding and purification and clarification is a lot of work, and will certainly bring you a lot of tests and trials. Okay, thank you for the question. All right, next question is from Caitlin, who sent these over from Instagram, and she has two questions. Or actually 3 questions. So the first one is, have you delved much into numerology as a study of people and their purpose according to Pythagoras' original concept of numbers? If so, what are your thoughts about it and its place in the realm of esoteric teachings and knowledge? Is it just another self-obsessed fad? All right, so background context, Pythagorean philosophy is something I did write a book on. It's called Pythagoras and the Philosophy of Number, I believe. And the purpose of that was to go into really examine the creation story that is laid out in esoteric philosophy, and that I originally put forth in a previous book on esoteric Buddhism that I wrote. So the Pythagoras one was meant to pair with that book on Buddhism, and to compare and contrast the creation stories and show how these creation stories are depicted in 2 different cultural systems, with two different emphases on them. And so that is going to be my home base. That's that book for my teachings on my interpretation of Manly Hall's teachings on Pythagoras. So there's a applied aspect to the philosophy of number, which has to do with numerology. And there is definitely a legitimate aspect to this, as far as I understand. But like the applied science of esoteric knowledge, like the proper way to do this and the way to navigate the use of occult techniques is something that would be taught to students in the later aspects of the mysteries. So you would have to go through a probationship, you have to go through, your cleansing, you have to go through the initial initiation steps before you're given the power to correctly use these type of disciplines. And this goes with not just this, but astrology for sure, alchemy, advanced yoga techniques. Anything that's an applied aspect of esoteric teachings is something that is meant to be approached at a certain time and place in your studies. And so, given that we live in a time when the mystery schools are not operating in a public capacity, in which esoteric knowledge is being rediscovered, but under no guidance or under no custodianship of an authority, a legitimate authority over them, people are sort of haphazardly taking the bits of information that they find and they're experimenting with using it and putting in application before it would be appropriate. And so I think numerology is one of these things. And my sort of advice on this field, as in most things, most esoteric or occult applied practices, is that there is a legitimate use of them, but if you're like a new student in the realm of esotericism, it's not important or advised that you use them. You're much better well served, in my opinion, sticking with the fundamentals of what it means, So rather than focus on like how do I use numerology, more focus on like what does it mean in terms of confirming certain ideas about the universe and about the fact that there is a pattern in nature that is numerical, as Pythagorean philosophy demonstrates, that gives evidence to the fact that there is a divine mind or a universal intelligence. And then the best thing you could do, in my opinion, is to commit yourself, if you recognize that that is true, commit yourself to living a life and serving a purpose and forming relationships with others and sort of cleansing yourself, putting your mind in order, etc. To focus on those things that are within your control and are more appropriate to the early stages of initiation, the early stages of the mysteries, rather than focusing on skipping ahead and trying to find a shortcut to advanced knowledge, such as numerology. And part of my thinking on that also is that if you're not fully, and this is not just numerology, astrology, and all these things, this also applies. If you're not completely a master and are very comprehensively trained in how to use these techniques and also how to avoid the pitfalls associated with them, if you apply them before you're ready, then you're setting yourself up for a situation where you're either giving advice to somebody or you're following it yourself, an incomplete use of information. You can apply an incorrect diagnosis to how you're using these techniques. So you can if you use numerology incorrectly, even if it's just a minor incorrection, that could end up setting in motion a series of events based on you following the guidance or following the directions of what your numerology analysis is. And it would lead you down a wrong path because you somehow misapplied the science, misapplied the technique. And so that's something you have to be very careful about, especially, like astrology, it's very obvious. Like if you try to optimize your life according to your reading of your horoscope, but your reading is incorrect, then you're not actually optimizing your life. You're setting up a systematic, you're setting up systematic error in your life by following a course of, or a path that's not actually in alignment with the stars, so to speak. But you believe that it is because you misapplied the science. So there definitely is something to numerology, but I don't recommend. I think it's interesting. It can be interesting to study, just like a lot of advanced things. But I don't really recommend giving advice to others based on it, or really taking it too far in terms of how you apply it to your life, because of the reasons I just mentioned. So yeah, that's my technique. That's my thinking. And I feel like ultimately the proper use of these things won't come until we have a restoration of the mysteries. We need that institution to guide the use of occult exercises and to really guide initiation, the initiation process. So anyway, that's my thinking on that. All right, second question. Many of the esoteric philosophies refer to the law, and I have a basic sort of understanding of what this means and represents, but I'd like to know if there's more info on this law anywhere that you know of that delves into specifics. After all, the layers of perception have been dissolved. All that's left is to live according to the law. So I agree the law is a foundational part. I mean, really the whole field of esoteric philosophy is you're trying to understand the law. And the whole teachings are derived from the idea that there is a law that exists and can be understood and applied. And when you apply your studies of the law to yourself, then you align yourself more and more with that law, and in that way you facilitate your own evolution, your own growth. Basically, the law is this. It coincides with this idea of a cycle. So there's a unified consciousness in the beginning, and then for a purpose, as a deliberate act, this unified consciousness partitions itself into a trinity, and then there's further partitioning. But this partitioning is what coincides with the idea of onset of a creation cycle. But when this cycle begins at the very beginning, it doesn't do so without a plan, because ultimately the sort of partitioning of consciousness, it's ultimately destined to at the end of the cycle to return to unified consciousness. So there is a alpha and omega. Once the alpha begins, inbuilt in that beginning, there is an end that it must come back to. All things it has to return to the eternal state of unity. And so what happens is that in the beginning, at the very beginning of this partitioning of unified consciousness, I think of it as a meditation. There's the beginning of an active meditation process that before an aspect of this unified consciousness injects itself into the field of creation and sets in motion the things that will play out in the cycle, what Stanislav Grof calls the cosmic game. Before it injects itself into this cosmic game and forgets its own unity and goes into an experience of diversity, there is an establishment of a law for what is to be worked out and what is to be experienced. So there's a partitioning in a sense of consciousness, which is the thing that's going to be experiencing this cycle, and the law, which this experience of self-consciousness that is going to be taking place, it defines how that's going to happen and the parameters of its entry into a limited state of creative activity, a limited state of self-consciousness, and how that is going to return back out of it. So the law is ultimately the rules of the game, so to speak. And this is established as a fundamental element in the very beginning of the creative process. And this has to also do with the partitioning of spirit and matter. So spirit becomes the consciousness, and matter, embedded in matter, is the law. And so there's this correlation also with the mother, the divine feminine, and the law. And so, the womb that carries and gives birth to the creation is something that has the law that the consciousness must follow within that creation. And so, so there's this partitioning of consciousness and law, essentially, and that also, in my opinion, tells us something about what it looks like for a restitution of the divine feminine. And I think it has to do with a re-emergence in human consciousness of an appreciation and a reverence for the law, which we clearly don't have today. So, we have this drive to experience, but we don't have the respect that we need to discipline our experience according to law in order to really fulfill ourselves, fulfill our evolution. And I feel like that's a phase that the human soul has to go through. But so for me, part of the rebirth of civilization that is ahead of us is a rediscovery that God is not just this God the Father, but it's also God the Mother. And this reverence for the mother has to do with the reverence for the law. And it's interesting, the way we think about mother, when we talk about Mother Nature, it's like we're simultaneously talking about the fullness of life that is being played host to here on Earth. So it's the container of all these individual life forms is Mother Nature, but it's also the intelligence and the law that guides how these various life forms are fulfilling themselves, how they're being born or bursting forth. There's a plan and a pattern to how life grows and evolves. And so that's implicit in this idea of Mother Nature as well. So that's the law. It's this aspect of the creation cycle, aspect of God that establishes itself at the very beginning of the creative cycle, and the entirety of the creative cycle exists in relation to this law, which establishes how the whole thing is going to go. And so I know Manly Hall talks about this in his series in some of his teachings on Kabbalism, but he talks about how in the beginning there's this partitioning of consciousness and law. Essentially, this is what he says, me paraphrasing, and that the fullness of the law is never made available to the consciousness that's within creation until the point when it's ready to fulfill the cycle and have that like ultimate moment of self-consciousness before a dissolution back into, cosmic unity. So anyway, that's the law. And it also explains why Isis, so to speak, who represents this divine feminine, the mother aspect, matter, and the law, why the divine feminine is said to be the high priestess of the mystery schools. She contains the mysteries within herself. Well, that's what the law does as well. So there's a correspondence there. Okay, last question. This is a tough one. How has your own personal way of living and lifestyle been altered by studying esoteric philosophy? If it's not too personal, I'd like to know how this has impacted your spiritual journey, consciousness, and way of being. So, I have a somewhat incomplete response to this because I'm still growing and changing. And what's interesting is that I mentioned when I answered an earlier question that I sort of made a commitment to try to be of service when I was at an early age, and I felt like as long as I kept up with that commitment, that the universe has sort of guided me to help facilitate me to develop the skills and the knowledge required for me to contribute that purpose. And I'm saying that at a point where I'm still in the process of trying to fulfill that. But yeah, so my experience of my own life is very much like defined a lot by that experience of having made a commitment and dedicating myself to something from an early age. And then even when I was in my early 20s, but even before I added like the philosophy stuff, back when I was mostly focusing on like the social sciences, I thought that was going to be the main field by which I made like a contribution. Like from an early point, the thing that kind of separated me from those around me in terms of how I experienced life is I always felt an obligation, like I had a mission, like I had to take my studies seriously, take things I was doing seriously, and that I didn't. So one of the things that did is that made me feel like I never had the total freedom to just live, to just focus on the things that would have brought me happiness or made me feel good. I felt like, no, I have to do this thing. I have to accomplish. I have a very much a drive and a need to accomplish. And the converse of that is my own feelings of self-worth in a large part are, whether I feel like, so it's a requirement for me to feel like I've succeeded. It's not just like, am I living in peace and harmony, and do I feel a connection with, the spiritual world, or do I feel a connection with God, which I do and has developed over this time. But my main thing is like, I feel like I can't rest until I accomplish this goal that I set for it. Like, I feel like I'll have like a soul contract in a way. And so the flip side of that is that because I feel so dedicated to accomplishing this goal, it is very much, it leads me to have very much a type of imbalanced life, which is like way too much intellect and too much work really, and not enough like focus on myself, my own well-being, and a lot of goals I had in life which I don't spend any time pursuing, which a lot of these have to do with like my relationships with others, my connections with people, my connection to experience. Like, I feel like I sacrifice even like the experience of being alive day to day because I'm just so focused on checking things off, fulfilling goals. But once I started studying these things, esotericism, it helped me understand better the context by which my life has been playing out. It helped me think of, so it's really shaped my perception of the world, even if it hasn't necessarily given me the freedom. Like, I don't feel the freedom to make a drastic change. Like, I set intentions for certain things, but there are certain areas that I just don't feel the support of the universe, so to speak. Like I feel nudged in one direction, but I also feel like the universe is giving me a hard time in terms of opening the door for me to making changes in certain areas of my life. I guess what I'm trying to say is I'm willing to sacrifice certain things to accomplish goals. And in a way, that's always been my inclination, but now I sort of self-consciously participate in that. And that sort of trade-off, and I feel a big thing is that I listen a lot more. Like, I do this thing of setting intentions and then listening to see like where am I being guided to go and what direction am I not being guided to go in. So just to give you an example, like, I listen for synchronicities a lot, and I will check my horoscope. I don't optimize my life around it, but I will check it to see if there's any clues in there. And I don't do an in-depth analysis because I don't feel like I'm ready to do that yet, but I'll at least look at my planetary alignments, and I'll see what's suggested by them, and that might help me nudge me in one direction or another. But I just to give one very small example, I specifically remember like 2021-ish, when I started going deeper into my astrological studies, and a lot of the work I did back then is set up for me to eventually use when I write my book on astrology and the 21st century. But I remember I had this debate I was having where I was like, should I keep studying this in the realm of applying it to like the study of civilization, or is it time for me to take some of these lessons? Should I learn it more to apply it to my own life and start doing like should I commit more to learning my horoscope rather than like the studying it in terms of trying to find out like the fundamental teachings of it and how it applies to like the history of civilization and stuff. So I was like, should I keep studying the collective, or should I just rebalance and focus on myself for a while? Because I could use some more knowledge and guidance in my personal life. And I know it would be very helpful if I knew more about how I could do a more in-depth reading of myself. So I was having this debate back and forth, like, what should I prioritize? This is a period right before, this is really before I had started, this is like right before I was really starting to write my first books and my first publications. So I was at this point where I was like, I was at a point in my studies where I was like, should I specialize towards myself, or should I keep focusing on writing something that has to do with more the big picture story of civilization? And so, I mean, in a way, I ultimately feel like that's big picture story of civilization, of man, the story of mankind, and how, these big picture issues of like what's the relationship between man and God and things like that. That's the thing, the realm I think ultimately I can contribute to, is like that narrative, like building a new myth around these philosophic teachings, and in a way like bringing philosophy out. My focus is always like on this mission of like how do I use this, and I don't really focus on using them for myself. So I was having this debate with myself, like at this point in time in 2021, where I was like, should I stop and use them on myself and maybe push back the writing these books and stuff like that until I'm at a better state in my own life. And so I was just having this back and forth, and I was like, you know what, like maybe it's more appropriate before I start teaching other people about philosophy, like I should apply it better to myself. I should be in a better emotional mindset. I should not be like, I struggle off and on with depression over the years because of the lifestyle I lead, because it's so imbalanced, because I neglect my emotional well-being and my physical engagement with the world. So it's like, you can't be happy and live a very imbalanced life, in my opinion. And at least that for myself. So I desperately wanted to rebalance. And I was like, maybe if I just started studying this philosophy and just take some time to learn how to apply it to my own life, like that would be the best use. So I was having a walk down the street, and I was like literally in my head weighing the two, and at a certain moment I was like, you know what, I think I should put things on the pause for a while and just start studying so I can learn how to apply this to myself, and then I'll be in a better position to finish the books, or to get started with writing the books. Again, this was like right at a point before I had started putting things out. And so basically I was like deciding how to allocate my time. And at the moment I was like, at the very moment I thought, I'm going to focus on myself for a while. At that very moment, I stepped in dog shit. It was like instantaneous. I was like, you know what? I'm going to focus on myself. And then as soon as I did that, it was stepped in dog shit. And so like, that's the kind of thing where I'm saying I listen a lot, because that synchronicity of that moment, first off, it made me laugh, the timing of it, because it was so in your face. So at that moment I was like, well, that was a sign, like I'm not going to do it. I immediately was like, okay, I made a wrong decision. I'm going to pivot back, and I'm going to refocus on what I'd been doing, which is like to try to get these books out, and I'll just do my best to just push through whatever problems I was facing in my own life, and just to get started writing on this larger story of like mankind. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about, where that's how one of the ways I apply these teachings is like I look at things as being inherently meaningful. I look at the world, like I said, like having a plan, a divine purpose. There's an intention of things that's masked from us, but we gradually participate in that purpose, and more gets revealed to us about it. And I could give you so many examples of these kind of synchronicities in my relationships. I had a couple car accidents since 2020, 2 different ones that both had a lot of synchronicities to them, and a lot of like inherent meaning to me in terms of what happened in those. I won't go into it at the moment, but so I have this. So it inspires me to have a very participatory relationship with the universe, and to allow myself to be guided in a way. And then over time, I also, like I said before, it's a big thing for me to set an intention and then see what kind of feedback I'm getting from the universe. And so that's really been a significant part of my life. So, and also to release control. So it's a lot of times very frustrating if you set an intention and you're not getting the feedback, to realize that you want, to realize that you're not in control, and to just give it to God, or give it to the gods, so to speak, and recognize that, just set yourself up to be an instrument of a larger purpose. But even though you don't know how that's going to play out, we're also recognize that you have karma that you'll have to work through, and that you will experience challenges, but try to embrace everything that happens in a constructive way. And and also that the more that you become aware of your own shadow, doesn't mean you can easily let go of those tendencies, but those complexes, but being aware of your own shadow allows you to participate more constructively, in my opinion, with how those tendencies get activated. And then ultimately it's a process of transmuting a shadow complex from a negative thing to a positive, constructive thing that you can actually will facilitate your own development as a person. So anyway, those are some of the ways that these teachings have influenced my personal life. I mean, certainly intellectually, they have shaped the way I look at the world, and the way I write about human history, and the way I write about sociology and psychology. So, but those things are more obvious, and you can read that influence in my writing, and in podcasts I do. But in my personal life, those are the things I was just talking about, is the way that it influences how I think. And so, I really try to live with this idea of reincarnation in mind, and that even though I would like to have certain things happen in this life, the goal is not necessarily to optimize any individual life, but to serve the higher aspect of yourself, that's the reincarnating self. And so if you can serve the needs of that, I think that that's a good way to look at finding meaning and purpose in life, is that you're intended to be an instrument of this higher self within, which is basically the aspect of you that's connected directly to God. Okay, I hope that was adequate answer. Thanks, Caitlin, for writing in. And a couple more left. So I have multiple questions in this one. This is from Lauren. She writes, "Hello, Alex. Hope all is well. I've had so many questions come and go since you've requested them for the Q&A. I'm going to throw them at you as they come in no particular order, so I don't talk myself out of asking. Number one, I'm confused by this question has to do with my book on the 20th century. I'm confused by FDR's occult New World Order influences. Do you think he was nefarious and working on behalf of the oligarchy? I think I remember in your Manly Hall documentary, which is like the unofficial documentary I cut together on him, which you can find on YouTube. It's also you can find a link, you can find a link to it on my Substack as well. But she says, I think I remember in your MPH doc, it pointed towards his decisions aligning with his belief in America's democratic destiny, which conflicts with the idea he was working for Wall Street to secure their interests, but I might be misremembering. So that's a good question. I do feel like, FDR was someone who had influences in all the different major elements of society. So he was the president, and that way he interfaced with the democratic public. Then he was linked into the world of oligarchy, and his new deal aligned with the Rockefeller vision for how to install their system of corporate welfare on America, and to preempt the unfoldment of more drastic democratic claims by the populace. This is all things I talk about in the 20th century book. And then he was also a Freemason and had at least some awareness of Manly Hall's teachings, since during the war he sent a crew out there to scan, and I think it's called microfiching, which is like an early version of scanning and making records of a lot of his most important alchemical works. So he had links to various elements of society, and the way I look at this is I almost feel like this is somebody who incarnated here with this mixed bag of karma to work out, and it was his particular soul pattern was such that he was positioned to play a particular role in the unfoldment of the world. Really all world leaders, for good or bad, are people who on the individual have karma that aligns in some way with how the world karma, the world soul, is playing out. And so that is what leads them to play a particular role, because no individual is actually absolutely evil, where it's all just one soul, one world soul, moving into manifestation and evolving itself. I feel like FDR's Masonic connection was leveraged by different groups to fulfill different purposes. Freemasonry was always an outer vehicle of a deeper esoteric organization or order. So one of the roles that it played early on is, number one, it preserved within itself certain key rituals and symbols which would be important for the future to be preserved. Now, that doesn't mean that the individual members of it are fully aware of what the symbols mean. In fact, Manly Hall says that almost immediately the meaning was lost to the upper stratum of Freemasonry, and that there was a point when the Rosicrucian order, which represents the deeper esoteric thing that was working through this outer vehicle, it detached itself from Freemasonry. But Masonry really represents this network that became absolutely crucial to draw on and utilize. It was a trans-European and actually then established branches in America, and it became this organizing mechanism to bring about certain large-scale changes in world order, including the founding of America, but also the revolutions that took place in Europe, and ultimately the rise of the nation state, the rise of the modern scientific age, and the world order was basically all set in motion by this network. But the network has to be oversold by something else. So when that soul departed from the body, so to speak, then that network remains in place. It becomes kind of lost, and it's easily co-opted. So my feeling is that these Masonic networks were ultimately used and co-opted and used as vehicles of other groups. On one level, the oligarchy started using secret societies to perpetuate its interests. On another level, this deeper technocratic entity undoubtedly used these Masonic networks, these legacy networks, to implement some of its own goals. And then periodically, I think that a deeper esoteric order would come in and use them to fulfill its purposes. My theory is that Manly Hall, who in my opinion references an authentic connection to the mystery schools and esoteric order, he, during this brief window of time, him and people like Nicholas Roerich came together to fulfill certain goals of this deeper esoteric institution that were involved with seeding the symbolism on the dollar bill. That was an important marker for them to put. And so I feel like there was a mobilization and a use of these Masonic networks in a very targeted way at that point to fulfill that goal. So if you just think of things in terms of social networks, that I think that's the best way to look at Masonry. It's a social network that can be put to use for a variety of purposes, depending on who's like pulling the levers, and even more than one group can be acting on it at a given time. So ultimately, FDR was one of these people who got used, one of these persons who got used by a lot of different actors for different purposes, because it's also undoubtedly true that he was connected to this whole world of oligarchy and the plan to establish a sort of world empire, turn America into a world empire. And so I don't particularly think that he was very far-sighted in his philosophical understanding, even though if he may have interests in esotericism or in philosophy. I ultimately think that he was subject to a lot of different pressures and was used by different groups for different purposes. So I think that he was a complicated figure in history. Okay, second question. Why do you think Engdahl, F. William Engdahl, who's one of my primary sources in the book on the 20th century, I love his work. Why do you think Engdahl and other authors were not eliminated as a threat during their research? Seems like certain people disappeared, others continue to proliferate information. That's a good question. I mean, part of that has to do with their own karma, their own relationship with God, their own destiny. Part of it, I think, has to do with, when we talk about the deep state or the shadow government, I think it's more of a social space than a well-organized entity, because there is this realm of shadow and secrecy that's surrounding it and compartmentalization. I feel like there's a lot of different groups that are acting for their own interests within that world. And when those people come out, when the activities of this shadow realm, shadow government or whatever shows itself when they are targeted assassinations and things like that, it seems like, it's one coordinated entity, but I don't feel like it is. So it could be partly that some researchers who are doing this are in the wrong place at the wrong time, or pissed the wrong people off, or drew the attention of certain people at the wrong time. And that's why they feel this wrath, whereas others kind of go under the radar. I mean, just for example, there's this notion that, over the past 10 plus years, there's been a lot of researchers in the health and wellness field who have been killed off. and so there's a lot of suspicious activity in that realm. At the same time, not everybody was killed off, because we still have all these, prominent figures who are speaking out about or in support of health freedom and against the corruption of the medical cabal. So why some people and not others? I mean, it's almost like a philosophical question, but I think that, I don't have all the answers. But my feeling is that it's not, this shadow government is not all knowing necessarily. At least at the level of oligarchy, at the level of the cabal and all that stuff. I look at the shadow government as having these two phases: a deeper technocratic aspect, but then there's this outer aspect, and which is like the oligarchy, the corruption, the capitalists, and the cartels. So yeah, I don't know why exactly some people seem to get targeted and others don't. When you go into the realm, when you go into that deeper realm of the technocracy and the protection of secret technology, it seems like every single person who branches out and starts to research like etheric energy, that they all get shut down in one way or another. I mean, there's a reason that these technologies have been independently discovered by all kinds of inventors over the past 100+ years, and there's a reason that all of them that we still don't have this technology, and it's still, we just whisper about it. There does seem to be a very well organized and centrally coordinated enforcement effort at that deeper technocratic level, but on the level of these syndicates of cartels and the sort of greedy capitalists who are implementing gradually the institutional structure of world civilization, doing it for their own purposes, thinking that they're going to install like global feudalism. There doesn't seem to be as well organized of coordination, and so I don't feel like that this deeper technocracy is necessarily interested in killing off health leaders, for example, or scholars like F. William Engdahl. It's like these periodically they'll fall under the attention of this cabal, this syndicate of capitalist interests, and sometimes people get killed and sometimes they don't. One interesting person to look at is Catherine Austin Fitts, who she was someone who worked on Wall Street and also worked in government, and then realized the corruption, and she speaks out about it. So why isn't she killed? Well, she started to develop a program that could be used to track the fraudulent move of money in the American economy, which would sort of give proof to the idea that there is a sort of New World Order, quote unquote, network that is running America like an empire, and is completely going against the democratic institutions of the country and the process, and sort of systematically deconstructing them. So that would have been revealed if this software would have been allowed to come out. So it wasn't until she had something that was legitimately a threat to them that they spent all this money and time and resources to steal her technology and to do everything they could to put her in jail. And she talks about how there was a lot of like illicit attempts to poison her and things like that. But then eventually she got to a certain point where she was able to beat the charges. She spent like all her fortune that she had developed on Wall Street on it. And she finally was able to fight the case, and that was fraudulent against her, and that all these people were conspiring together to put her in jail, essentially. So she won the case, and then it was like, you don't get to know exactly what happens in the world of the shadow government, but there was some decision was made or something happened where the people who were persecuting her were basically backed off, and it was like she's allowed to exist. But the thing is, they took her software, and she would never be allowed to. It was made clear that you're not going to be allowed to. Like, you can speak about it, but you're not going to be allowed to develop actual tools and solutions. So she remains today a prominent speaker against this syndicate and trying to draw people's awareness to it. The government, the three branches that are set up to give balance and to give justice in society, because it's operating outside of them. It's able to kill with impunity without the feedback of censure, without the feedback of having the CIA go to jail or whatever. It's able to act outside of law. So that's a long answer, but that's my feelings on like why certain people seem to meet the wrath of God, and some are able to live to tell their tale. Okay, a couple more questions. This next one comes from Chris John, from Instagram. And he asked me this question. I actually responded to it on Instagram, but I just wanted to read my answer. It has to do with the Israel situation. He says, I love all your content with all your knowledge. It would be silly for me to think I know better than you. Well, don't think that. But when it comes to this, how do you explain the extreme overrepresentation of Jews and dual citizenship Israelis within the United States government? I agree that the U.S. has become a corporate oligarchy, as you say so often, but it still seems to me that there is something behind the scenes orchestrating much of what has occurred in the past 2 centuries. And then my response was, I think in America, behind the oligarchy is the very secret entity in charge of all the secret technology. That's the ultimate source of power in the world today. I think the presence of Zionist networks all over American empire is a means for this very secret entity to accomplish certain goals for its own ends, using an instrument that is self-motivated and therefore useful to fulfill those goals without knowing the hidden agenda about these secret black projects. So if the hidden secret black projects, if that entity in charge of them needs a world civilization in order to ever reveal its technologies, then it would need to use a variety of outer instruments to accomplish this. But these can't know they're being used by this deeper entity or that it has secret weapons. This is kind of what I was just saying earlier. So it's best to work through actors that are self-motivated. This is an important thing, the self-motivation aspect. It's like if you need someone to accomplish a goal, but you don't need them to know why, then you find someone who's self-motivated on their own to do the thing that you need them to do. So it's best to work through actors that are self-motivated to set up the foundations of world empire for their own reasons. Ultimately, at the right time, the Black Project's world will seize control of this whole apparatus. So the groups who are motivated to pursue world empire on their own, like the Zionists, for example, for ideological reasons, or the Muslim Brotherhood for their own reasons, or the Christian fundamentalists for their own reasons. Everybody has their own fantasy about empire and their own motivation for doing it. But at the point when that empire is finally ready to be set up, like the World Economic Forum and the industrialists have their own reasons, and the capitalists and the bankers, everybody has their own reason, but they're all being used as tools to build out the infrastructure. And that's why I think there's a hidden hand who's organizing them all. So I don't think any one group is driving it, but you'll see networks of all these different constituencies, but they're all filled with self-motivated actors. But the whole thing comes together to make this organized picture, because I think there's a deeper hidden hand who's maneuvering them as like chess pieces. And the reason it's not doing it on its own directly is because it has to remain secret and compartmentalized until finally environment of competitive geopolitics is overcome and a world structure of civilization has been put into place, including a information control grid and all that stuff. So that's my kind of like my meta theory that I put out in that book on the 20th century. So the oligarchs are motivated to pursue, the bankers and stuff are self-motivated to pursue empire. The technocrats and the WEF have their own motivations. Zionists have theirs. Muslim Brotherhood types have theirs. So everyone plays their role without knowing the ultimate agenda. And at some point, they're all going to discover that they were played, and that this is what I mean. They're going to be sacrificed. The whole network that built out empire will be sacrificed once the global civilization is founded, because the technocracy is going to rise with their technology, and that'll be the ruling power. All right, so that was my response to Chris John. Thanks for writing the question. And last question now of the Q&A. This is from Antti. This is a Finnish name, so I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but he wrote to me on IG. He says, "Hey Alex, I've been trying to fit the Antarctic Treaty to the bigger political picture, but can only formulate well-rationed guesses. Do you have content discussing the theme of Antarctica or insight what is going on there? Looking forward to your response." There certainly is a mystery to Antarctica. Some of the best work I've seen is by, or most interesting anyway, is from Joseph P. Farrell. He talks about some of the weird history of Antarctica. My feeling is that there's probably artifacts and probably remnants or proof of the Atlantean era of civilization stored in Antarctica. Some of the mysteries of the physical planet could also interface in a way. So, like, if the mystery of Antarctica was really explored and some of its mysteries discovered too early, it could dash the modern worldview, the sort of mythic structure that dominates the current civilization, and this mythic, the sort of secular scientific worldview is very important for the world to believe in at this current phase, while it's this architecture of empire is being built out. And so my feeling is that the mysteries of Antarctica will not be fully revealed until there's a revelation of a lot of different things that have to do with the formal move towards world civilization, which I think the Great Reset is ultimately about. And so, so my ultimate feeling is that like the Great Reset and the death rebirth ritual that we're all going through is going to include, not just destruction of things and trials and tribulations, but will also coincide with revelation of a number of different things. And ultimately, I hope that it also includes the revelation of the mysteries and so some of the deeper philosophic, spiritual truths. But my feeling is that Antarctica interfaces with some of these deep mysteries of human history and also of this world that we inhabit. Also, one thing I want to say is that some of the mysteries of the electromagnetic field and the ether might interface with Antarctica, or the poles, both the poles in general. And so these are all mysteries that have to do with one level esotericism and the mysteries, on another level with the science and tech of the ether energy. So I feel like we won't know the true mysteries of what's being concealed there until, because there's layers of misinformation, clearly deliberately planted misinformation, but we won't know the mysteries of it, the full mysteries of it, until I think we have this formal event take place where it's like, okay, the modern world paradigm, world order is going to be deconstructed, collapsed, or reset, so to speak, and we have a series of events move in the direction of an establishment of a formal system of world government and the revelation of the technocracy and their secret weapons and technology, energy technologies. So when that happens, I feel like there will be a revelation of a number of different things. A number of falsehoods will be revealed as falsehoods. There'll be a new paradigm of human thought coming out. And so my thinking is that the mysteries of Antarctica and a number of other things, the mysteries of the solar system, the mysteries of a lot of different things will be revealed, and a lot of truths that we hold on to today will be dashed. That a lot of people hold on to. Yeah. So anyway, the mysteries of the earth are part of the mysteries of humanity and of God and the universe, and these mysteries will be revealed hopefully in our lifetime. At least some of them will be pointed to, and a big part of that will just be dashing a lot of things that are deliberately not true. So yeah, Antarctica interfaces with a lot of these things. So I don't have a good answer about what's going on specifically in Antarctica, but it's clearly this mysterious area where there's a lot of disinformation and a lot of stuff going on, where it's like a pivotal thing to keep secret until the right time. And it's interesting. I've heard people talk about like how I heard someone reference recently that the idea that that world, a major global conflict won't break out, or the major catalyst for it breaking out would be somebody acting aggressively to take hold of Antarctica, this and the mysteries there, and so there is something clearly very important about Antarctica, but yeah, my feeling is that we won't know until the right time. Okay, that's it for the questions and answers. It's a much longer episode than I originally thought it was going to be, but I hope you stuck with it and I didn't ramble too much. I appreciate you guys all following the channel and sticking with it, despite the fact that I haven't done as much with it the past 5 or 6 months. And but I appreciate y'all's support. Please leave a review of the Manly P. Hall book if you've read it, or if you've just gone through the series. It would mean a lot to me and help that book find a larger audience. And so that's it for me. Thanks for tuning in. God bless. Take care.